I'm going to try to teach you the 12 most important middle game principles, and if you learn them, apply them, you should be able to find a plan in any middle game position. So we're going to start with the most important principle of all, and that's, what does your opponent want to do? That's a question you always have to ask yourself in any position, especially complicated middle game positions, and that can help you find a good plan. Most of the positions I've used as examples are from my own games, either when I did something good or when I did something very bad. This game, which was played only recently, is a great example of how not asking this question punished me and lost me the game. So what does my opponent want to do here? Well, they want to open up their bishop on c1 somewhere. Where can that bishop go? Not to d2, not to b2, that makes no sense. The bishop wants to come out to a3. So my opponent wants to play b3, bishop a3, and prevent me from castling. That's what they would like to do. I blundered here. I played queen a8, and I was immediately losing after b3. There is no way to prevent bishop a3. I cannot find a safe square for my bishop anywhere on the board. I played bishop d6, and after here I had to take, and I couldn't castle. So back to the original position. Had I asked myself the correct question, I would have found the only good move here, queen b6. Now what does queen b6 do? Well, it prevents b3, bishop a3. It's as simple as that. Why? If you play b3 now, I go bishop b4, and bishop a3 loses the knight. So I got to develop my bishop with tempo on the knight. Once the knight is saved, somehow I can castle, and bishop a3 is no longer a strategic threat. You will find this question everywhere in most chess books. Applying it is really simpler than it seems. Even if your idea is wrong, you'll still be improving your thinking process. So in any position, if you're trying to find a plan and you can see something active for yourself, even if you can, still ask yourself, what does my opponent want to do? Why? Because maybe the thing they're trying to do is going to win them the game if you allow it, as was the case here. So that's principle number one. Principle number two, or concept number two, is what I think is the second most useful question you can ask yourself in any middle game position, and that's, where are the weaknesses? Now, I'm not saying you're going to win material if you ask yourself this question, but it's going to highlight potentially good plans. It's going to make playing the middle game positions much easier. And simply asking yourself the question is going to give you an idea of what you should play for. So this game was played between Bhaskaran Adiban and Sethuraman back in 2008. I chose this game, I chose this example because it was really instructive. So let's figure out where the weaknesses are. Now, what are weaknesses? Well, it's something that's not defended or something that's not sufficiently defended that can easily be attacked. So in this case, I would say this bishop is not defended. The g7 pawn is not defended. The d6 bishop is kind of loose. The c5 pawn is kind of loose, so is the b7 pawn. And once you identify these weaknesses, Adiban's move becomes very, very logical. So c5 is the biggest weakness, and we can double attack it. b6 defending the pawn doesn't work because the bishop isn't defended. So how do we attack the c5 pawn and prevent b6 from being played because the bishop is loose? Well, we play knight a4. How do you defend your pawn? You cannot defend your pawn. If b6, then I just take. And I'm completely winning, because if you take, I take the bishop on d6. So on knight a4, Sethuraman actually played c4, the only way to save the pawn. But now, knight b6 anyway. Now I'm on the c4 pawn. And worst of all, the bishop is still loose, the g7 pawn is still loose. You cannot take the knight. He played rook d8, and after this, the two other weaknesses are highlighted. Knight d4. If you take here, I still take. Then I take on g7. So bishop f7, and now knight f5. Something's gonna drop. You still cannot take on b6. you have to defend the g7 pawn, you have to defend the d6 bishop, you have to do something. In the game, Setoraman played knight e7, just giving up the g7 pawn, and Adiban went on to win. Now, this was back when both of them were 2400. So I thought this was an extremely useful example. So ask yourself where the weaknesses are. Okay, we're going to be playing this position out against Noctie to see how it will play against me in this tricky position where black has more weaknesses. So we're going to create a theme using this position. I've called it weaknesses. I'm going to play as white, and I'm going to play against queen 2. Now this should be about 2400 FIDE. So let's save the element. Let's save the theme. So where are the weaknesses? This is our theme. Now let's play it out. I have linked to the theme in the description. You can access it easily if you would like to play Noctie. So Noctie is a human-like AI, so it will play human-like moves in worse positions. So let's try knight a4. Let's see how it reacts. I think it's gonna go c4. Yeah, okay, now let's go knight b6. Oh, it really likes Adiban's move. I mean, it's an amazing move. Okay, so now knight d4 was played. And let's see. Setoraman brought the bishop back to f7. Maybe keeping it on the diagonal is a better idea. So now if I play f3, then there is takes. But what if we try to weaken the king? Wait, what do I do here? Can I just go knight takes c4 now and give up the exchange? f3 takes. I don't like that. I don't want to give up the exchange either. So let's try f3. I mean, I don't like f3. f3 takes. Yeah, I'm gonna try f3. It's okay. I didn't want to give up the exchange. So cb6, fg. Now let's see. I still have knight f5 targeting g. So, okay. Well, definitely knight f5. No? It gives you immediate feedback. Oh, I don't get to well, I do get to. So wait, if castles, okay, it didn't castle. So how can we cause some issues? If castles, I can take rook takes bishop c5. Is that good enough? Am I gonna have an infiltration square then? I don't think so. Yeah, I think this is just about equal. I think I did mess this up. Oh, could Noctie even take? Let's go h4. I mean, if castles, then rook d6, bishop c5, rook somewhere, bishop takes, king takes, rook e1 or rook d1. I would do that in an actual game. So let's see. Good moves. Takes. And now, yeah, now this is just equal. I'm not gonna keep playing this position. It seems about equal. I don't think I've achieved much. Principle number 3. What's the worst placed piece? Now this is applicable to your position and to your opponent's position. You need to answer that for both players. In this case, this is one of my games from the Bośniacy Open I played earlier this year, and I found the best plan here. I still lost the game afterwards, but I was much better. So what's black's worst placed piece? Well, the bishop on g7. What does that mean? It means let's not allow them to improve that piece. How could that piece be improved? Well, either by coming to h6, which isn't possible, or by getting rid of the e-pawn somehow. If this pawn weren't on the board, then, you know, the bishop's open. That begs the conclusion that bishop takes f4 is an extremely bad move because of e takes f4. Now, what's my worst placed piece? That's often more important. I would say it's definitely the bishop on e2. The bishop isn't doing much. Where can this bishop go? Well, bishop f1, bishop h3, trade itself off, get rid of my bad bishop. It's stuck behind its own pawns. So by simply asking myself this question, I managed to find the best plan. Some of you may take on c5, take on f4, I don't know, do something else, but it's actually necessary to improve this bishop, because until it improves, this knight is also bad. These two pieces are just dreadful. After my next move, bishop f1, everything is simple. I'm going to go knight h3, or I'm going to go knight e2, or I'm going to go bishop h3. All of a sudden, I don't have any more bad pieces. My position is perfectly fine. And this was the best move. I was much better. So in any position, always know the answer to this question. What's the worst placed piece? Now the next three concepts, outposts, open files, and infiltration squares, I'm going to illustrate all of them with maybe my favorite chess position of all time. This is a game played by Ivanišević, a Serbian grandmaster, and what he did here was so instructive that I think it's going to be stuck in my mind forever. This position I've used 20 times before in my videos with my students. It's a remarkable position. The engine doesn't give white a huge advantage. However, what white is about to do is so strong that black's position becomes unplayable, and black lost very quickly. So first of all, let's look at outposts. So outposts are squares where your opponent cannot challenge them with pawns on adjacent files, at least not easily, and your pieces are defended by your own pawns. In this case, we could say that f5 is sort of an outpost because it provokes g6 in order to be safeguarded, but we're able to create a true outpost with an amazing clearance sacrifice. Bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, and now we want to give this knight the d5 square, so we play d6. It doesn't matter that we've given up a pawn. Obviously, the pawn can be taken two different ways. However, black captures this, and they have to. We're going to have an outpost on d5, and we're going to be much better. In the game, cd6 was played by Miladinovic, and then knight d5. Which brings me to the next two concepts. Open files and infiltration squares. That's the key to any position. You always have to be aware of them. As a general rule, whoever controls an open file has the advantage. In this case, the C file is the only open file. By initiating this clearance sacrifice, white is already controlling it. The rook is perfectly placed, preventing rook c8. So if there is an open file in the position, you want to occupy it with your major pieces, ideally with your rooks. Now, infiltration squares are connected to open files because you usually get them for your major pieces. You can get them for your bishops, but it's usually the rooks that infiltrate, and it's usually the 7th rank which proves most deadly when an infiltration is successful. So let's look an alternative to c takes. Let's say knight takes. We go knight d5. The queen moves away somewhere, and the rook infiltrates. This is an infiltration square. If you can bring your major pieces into your opponent's position, if there's a possibility to do that, then that should be one of the strongest plans. So remember that pieces can be outposted even if it costs you material. If a piece is this good, the fact that you've given up a pawn makes no difference at all. If you get an open file along with that and the possible infiltration square, then that's huge. Let's play this one out as well. So I'm going to create a theme called Outposts. Once again, you can find it in the description below. I will be playing this as Queen 2 once again. Let's save this element, let's save the theme, and let's practice. So I'm going to do the same thing Ivanišević did in the game. I'm going to go bishop e7 and d6. I want to see how Noctie tries to fight me here. Okay, knight d5. Where does it put the queen? Okay, makes sense. I like knight b6 and winning the exchange. I think that works. No? What? Oh yeah, I'm just dumb. Okay, I'm gonna go back. This is actually another thing you can do with Noctie. If you mess up, you can ask for a hint, and it gives you some ideas. Queen f5, okay, queen b3 I understand. Queen f5 I don't understand. Takes, 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 knight f6. Okay, that's not something I would do in one of my own games. So I'll just play a human move. I'll try to double my rooks. Why is this bad? Okay. Okay. I mean, I'm sure white is still better. I'm gonna turn on the hint once again. Let's see. Rook c8 I understand. g3 I don't understand g3. So let's go rook c8. Now it says it's a bad move. Okay. Takes, takes. Where does the knight go? If knight f6, I have knight e7 winning immediately. Oh no, maybe not winning because of king g7. Yeah. Can I try to win the pawn? No. Oof. Oh Jesus. Yeah, no, I didn't see that. Let's go back. Okay, so Noctie is outplaying me from this position. Okay, I mean, you should use Noctie the same way I did. Even though I'm giving you an idea of how to formulate a plan, that doesn't mean that playing it out against Grandmaster Strength AI is going to be simple. So you can lower the level, of course, put it on Rook 2 and it's going to be easier. Let's go back to the video. Now, the next concept is from probably one of my favorite games ever. This was the game Aronian Kramnik. And in this position, h3 was played. Now that's a pawn hook. The next concept is pawn hooks and why moving pawns in front of your king is a very bad idea. It could be a very bad idea. Now let's consider the position before the pawn moves. How could black try to open up white's king side? Well, there is no way. Even if you manage to push your pawns all the way forward, let's just put something on the board, everything's gonna stay closed. Once you advance one final time, then white closes the position down, or if you advance this way, then takes, sorry. Oh, it's pinned. Let's move the bishop away. Takes, and closes the position down. So when the pawns are intact, there's always a way to keep things closed. As soon as you move one of the pawns, that's what we call a hook. Why? Because we're able to force open the position using this pawn as a target. Now if our pawn reaches g4, we are going to play gh3, opening up the g file. You may wonder, well, what happens on g4, h4? That's possible because of that, in most cases, what we want to do is blockade the hook to make sure it cannot move forward before we put pressure on it. So once again, I'm going to put a random position on the board. We blockade the hook, and now we play g4. Now, especially if the hook has another target 2 files next to it, so you can basically fork the hook and something else, that means you're forcing open the position. So after h3, a remarkable move was played which has never been seen before, and this was of course very deep preparation. Rook g8, highlighting that h3 is a very risky move. It's a pawn hook. What do we want to do? Well, we want to play g5. g5. The game went king h1, knight h5, controlling g5, c3 and g5. And the position's going to open up. knight e5 was played, g4. Okay, and the position is opening up. All of that became possible because h3 was played. So, as a general rule, do not move pawns in front of your king unless you absolutely have to. Okay, a very good example can be seen in the Sicilian Dragon. Let's imagine that this is a pawn on g6, where if once black plays g6, white's very common plan in the Dragon Sicilian is something like f3, again with colors reversed, queen here, bishop here, and h4, h5. This is a hook. So if g3 was played, then, you know, h5. Why not? Okay, the knight can blockade, but in many positions, we see this happen. This is actually a very good sacrifice. And especially in the Sicilian Dragon, this often works. So any pawn move in front of your king creates a pawn hook. Next concept, pawn breaks. Pawn breaks are essential to understanding an opening and any middle game. So let's go a bit backwards. This is the Botvinnik English, and it's all about pawn breaks. Very often finding a good plan requires you to identify pawn breaks. An easy way to do that is to follow your pawn chain. So for black, if we draw an arrow following black's pawn chain, it's very obvious that b5, b4 is what black should play for. If we follow white's pawn chain, it's actually looking at both sides of the board. So white should go f4 at some point, and white should go b4 at some point. So if you had black here, you couldn't go wrong with a move like rook b8, preparing b5. It just has to be a good move, because that's a pawn break the position yells for. If you play b5, b4, you will have achieved something. So in this position, rook b8 is in fact the most common move. And if you're on the receiving end of this and you see that your opponent is preparing a pawn break, well, then you have to react to it if you deem it worthy of a reaction or an overreaction. So white plays a4, giving away the b4 square completely. The knight's gonna land on b4 if black wishes to do so, but we had to prevent b5. We had to prevent an expansion. Of course, pawn breaks can be used for many different things. In the King's Indian defense, black plays f5 to start the kingside attack. In the closed check Benoni, white plays f4 or b4 and black plays f5 or b5 simply to get some breathing room. Pawn breaks are always something that should be considered as a middle game plan. So always look for them. And once again, the easiest way to identify a good pawn break is to follow your pawn chain. The next principle is relatively simple, but very powerful. And this is a game in which Magnus Carlsen had the black pieces against Kramnik, and he centralized his pieces in about 2 moves. His knights became monsters. Coming back to outposts, once again, e4 is of course an outpost for the knight, so let's connect the two. Magnus played knight e4. A centralized piece has a lot more influence. A good way to illustrate that is, let's imagine a knight on e8. What's it controlling? It's controlling c7 and b6, only 2 squares. What's the knight on e4 controlling? Well, f2, d2, c3, c5, d6, f6, g5, g3. Let's compare the 2 pieces. A knight in the center controls a lot more squares, and that's true for any piece. A bishop in the center usually x-rays 2 diagonals or 4 split diagonals. A queen in the center has a lot more targets. A rook in the center on a central open file has a lot more scope. So after knight e4, queen b3, rook g to e7 was played, queen a4, and now just knight e5. Once again, a centralization. Look at these 2 knights. Let's compare either one of these 2 knights to the knight on e1. A centralized piece leads to a good position. So whenever you can bring your forces closer to the center, you should consider that as a plan. Imagine a chessboard as a battlefield, and let's put it in 3D. And let's imagine the center of the board as a top of a hill where a battle is being fought. You don't want your pieces in the bottom of the at the bottom of the hill, so that they have to run up every time they have to fight. You want them all on top. Like if you have archers, you want them on the top of a hill, not at the bottom. So if you imagine a chessboard in 3D, the 4 central squares are the top of the hill, the top of the battlefield. You want your pieces there. Blockading past pawns is a middle game principle that I learned over and over again from bitter experience. This is my game against Lovro Novosel, where I was much worse already, but I wasn't losing yet. My opponent has a passed pawn. I have a 2-1 on the queen side, but it doesn't nearly compensate for his strong pawn. Passed pawns have to be blockaded as soon as possible. Why? Because if they aren't, they are going to move forward. So if we imagine this pawn being on d4 instead of d5, what would be the best move? Well, knight d5. No thinking about that. In this case, unfortunately, I cannot set up a blockade yet with bishop d6 because of stuff like this. That simply doesn't work. So what I did was bishop f6. My opponent played d6, and now I played knight d7, setting up a blockade and hoping to survive. I did not survive. My opponent outplayed me, but this was still the best chance. When your opponent has a passed pawn, you need to blockade it. And the same goes for isolated pawns. In a normal isolated queen's pawn position, the side that has the isolated queen's pawn usually plays for an attack. Plays to get rid of the pawn. If the pawn is on d4, then white usually aims for d5, getting rid of the pawn. And the side that's playing against the isolated pawn, instead of winning it, instead of putting pressure on it, blockades it. So if white has an IQP on d4, black is going to play knight d5. Black is going to play, let's say there's a white pawn on d4, you have a knight on f6. You play knight d5. If you have a knight on d7, you play knight b6, knight d5. Okay, that's how these things should be played. If you have a knight on c6, you play knight b4, knight d5, blockading the d4 isolated queen's pawn. Passed pawns are criminals, and as Nimzovich said, they need to be put under lock and key. And this concept has been known since the 19th century. A passed pawn has to be blockaded. The next concept is the concept of weak squares, which could be called outposts too, but this is a broader definition. Do not create weaknesses. Every time you move a pawn, every time you trade a pawn, you create weaknesses. In this case, black is completely dominant here. This is Nimzovich Yates, and Nimzovich is winning simply because there are so many weak squares in the white position that the black pieces can never be disrupted. f5 and d5 in particular. And by advancing the pawns, for example, by advancing the e pawn to e5, white has given up these two squares and black has exploited it perfectly. Now this doesn't mean you shouldn't move pawns. It means that you need to be aware that every pawn move creates weakness. Let's go back to this position where black plays rook b8 in order to play b5. We play a4, preventing the pawn break b5, but we've given up the b4 square. Okay, eventually a knight is going to land here. Weak squares are inevitable. You have to give squares to get squares. Okay, that's a saying. I don't know if it was Fischer or Kasparov who said that. I think it was Bobby Fischer. But as soon as you move a pawn, be aware that you're creating weaknesses. For example, in this case, if you play h4, you're weakening g4. If you play, I don't know, well, as soon as you play d4, you weaken d4 irreparably. So weak squares are inevitable. At least be aware of the weaknesses you're creating. However, in many cases, you shouldn't move pawns. You shouldn't create weaknesses. For example, if black instead of rook b8 plays king h8, a4 would be a very bad move. Why would you weaken yourself and allow knight b4 if b5 hadn't been threatened yet? All right. The final principle involves playing with a space advantage or playing without a space advantage. And this is extremely important, most people do not apply this. When you have more space, that in itself isn't an advantage. People say more space is good for you, and that's true, but it's the indirect consequences of the extra space that provide the advantage. The most important one is when you have more space provided by your advanced pawn chain, your pieces have more room to maneuver. So in this case, black's pieces, as you can see, are tied down on the first 3 ranks. White's pieces are on the 6th rank, 7th rank, 5th rank. They are all over the place. White has more space, white has more room to maneuver. So the concept of not trading when you have more space is absolutely crucial. How does black liberate himself from this position? Well, if we get rid of all the minor pieces, white's space advantage matters very little, if at all. So let's imagine all the minor pieces of the board, then b5 is weak, c5 is a passed pawn, it's equal. It's just equal. So when you have more space, you don't want to trade pieces. When you have less space, you want to trade pieces. Why? If you don't have maneuvering room without the pieces on the board, that doesn't matter, it's irrelevant. If we put 4 more minor pieces here for black and 4 more for white, let's say here and here and here and here, then white's advantage would be even greater. So fewer pieces on the board if you have less space. So in this case, Karpov is white against Heikki Vesterinen. He played knight e3, not only declining this trade, but also preparing knight c4 and then b6. So the game went bishop c8, knight c4, bishop e7, b6, and white went on to win in about 5 more moves. So I hope you liked these 12 middle game principles. I tried to make it succinct and understandable and easy to follow. Please let me know what you think. And thank you very much. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.